I recently put out a video on Instagram and TikTok titled, "Should I rent or buy a house?" And it's safe to say that the message of that video was, shall we say, slightly misinterpreted in the comments. And if you've ever been to a TikTok comment section, well, there's an interesting mix of people, to say the least. But some of the comments from the people with actual profile pictures and real names were very interesting indeed. People were passionately arguing that renting is more expensive and that house prices always go up and that buying is the only real way to build wealth. And if you buy a house for 400k and I asked you, how much did you pay for that house? You would reply 400k. But you didn't pay that at all. And that's something that I think that not enough people realise. The true cost of buying a house and whether or not renting is actually better for you financially. Because in the UK, we are completely obsessed with home ownership. Go to school, get a job, get a partner, get married, save for a house, buy a house, raise a family in it, you know the drill. And 86% of Brits that don't own a home aspire to one day. But the thing is that actually the right thing to do? This is a decision that millions of us will face at some point, and it's one of the most hotly debated topics out there. Now, you've probably heard phrases like, renting is just dead money. You're better off putting that rent into your own pocket. But is that really true? Or are we better off renting or perhaps investing the money we would have normally used to save for a deposit with? Whilst I absolutely understand why these views are so popular, the truth is a lot more complex, and that's what we're going to unpack today, the answer to this question. And by the end of this video, you'll understand the real pros and cons of both buying and renting, how to crunch the numbers and evaluate what works for your own situation, and why the choice isn't always as black and white as people might think. And I'm going to show you how to use actual data and real examples, how renting and investing can sometimes outperform buying a home and vice versa. So let's get into it. Right, just to be clear, I have absolutely no agenda here today. In fact, I actually own my own home. I'm potentially looking to invest into property soon too, and I also invest in the stock market. Prior to this, I actually rented for 12 years before being in a position to buy. So I'm not going to say either one is better than the other than what the facts and the numbers will tell us. Okay, first up, we're talking about renting. Let's take a look at that. And if we take the average UK rent, which is currently £1,250 a month, and then the average rental time for a property is just under 5 years. So I'm just going to round that up and keep it simple at 5 years. Then we need to factor in potential price increases from the landlord, and they normally come in about what the rate of inflation is. So for this, I'll take around 3%. So by the end of the fifth and final year, your rent for inflation adjusted rent would be £1,440. So on average, that would give us a figure of £1,350 for inflation adjusted rent. Now, I'm not going to mess around with bills and council tax, etc., because these vary enormously based on where you live, the size of your house, whether your landlord includes bills or not, whether the property is even furnished or not, and so many other factors too. I'm going to do the same on the buying side too, so we can keep things pretty simple. So moving on to buying a house, again, I'll take the average UK price of a house, which is currently £293,000 as of August 2024. Now, the average deposit for a house in the UK for a first-time buyer is currently 19%. I was actually quite surprised by that, but because you guys can get mortgages at 5% or a little bit more, I'm going to lower this down to 15%. I think 15% is fair. So 15% of 292,000 is £43,950. Now, this money goes straight into your equity pot and it comes off the principal amount of the property and is not included in the mortgage term. Right now, we're just about brushing close to 4.5% for a 15% mortgage. That's the interest rate that you'll pay on the mortgage, but this is expected to come down in 2025, albeit not by much. So I'll balance it out at 4%. As I think this is where we'll end up there or thereabouts. If you took a mortgage out on a 25-year term at this rate of 4%, your monthly repayment would be £1,314. Now, the mortgage payment is partly covering the interest and partly building equity in that property. Now, one thing I think that people don't realize is the full amount that they're actually paying. And in this case, with the interest included, you'd be paying £394,207 in total. And that's if you were to stay there at that same same property for the full 25 years on those terms. Obviously, building equity here means you're growing your pot every time you make a mortgage payment, and over time, the amount you pay in interest gets smaller, and you pay more towards the principal amount simply because the debt is smaller, but your payments remain the same if you were to stick on, say, a 4% interest rate, for example. Then comparing this to rent, of course, like all of that money that you're paying each month is going towards your landlord. So you are in fact potentially saying, some people will argue this, losing all of that money. Now, one thing to definitely factor in here when you own a property is the maintenance of it. And that's safe to say that it will be around about 1% of the property price per year, which will be put on. So in this case, it's £2,930 a year going towards the upkeep of that property. Now, when you rent, all of that cost goes on to the landlord and not yourself. So that's a considerable amount of money that you're saving every year. And obviously, when you own that property, that money is going on top of your mortgage payment. And of course, yes, it's not a monthly fee and works are sporadic, but it's a pretty accurate representation of how much you'd need to fork out a year on just upkeep as a homeowner. There are, of course, a lot of varying factors in this. I currently live in a new build, so my maintenance cost has been pretty much a few £100 over the last 4 years that we've owned it. But an older property could require significant investment to upkeep. It could even be higher than that 1%. And there's likely to be a lot more issues that arise in older properties. Okay, next up we have purchasing fees. And if you're buying a house, if you're a first-time buyer, you'd pay no stamp duty at the £293,000. But if you're a homeowner already, you'd pay roughly £4,500, which is changing from April 2025 when the rates do change. So this is what I'm going to base it on, as it's unlikely you're going to find and move into a place before then anyway, by the time this video comes out. And then other costs on top of this. This is buying a house still. Your moving fees, solicitors, surveyors, mortgage fees, etc. And for £293,000, it is safe to say you would budget around £5,000 from that. So on top of your deposit payment, you'd be looking at around about £49,350 as a first-time buyer and a £53,750 as a standard buyer or a current homeowner as the full amount you'd need to put down as the cost to buy that home. So monthly mortgage payments added, that's a £1,314 a month, plus the cost of maintenance of £2,930 a year, split down into monthly payment, which is around about £244 a month, and that's £1,558 a month. Then if you actually took that £50,000, that would equate to just under 5 years of rent right there. So realistically, in a lot of areas, it's much more expensive to buy than it is to rent, especially because interest rates have risen quite a fair bit recently, and even bringing them down from where they are means monthly costs are still a little bit higher. Now, people tend not to factor in maintenance costs, and I just think this is a grossly underestimated cost for so many people. They see a mortgage payment and a rental payment as it is, but the truth is your costs as a homeowner are more than you might expect. Then you have to factor in stumping up over £50,000 in the first place to even buy that house, which if you were tucking away 20% of an average UK salary, which sits around £2,350 a month, that would take you 8.8 years to find. Now, yes, of course, you could get in cheaper and have a 5% deposit, but then your monthly cost will increase because your mortgage will be bigger and your interest rate would likely be higher in a lot of cases because of what's called your loan to value rate. So a 5% deposit would give you a 95% loan to value. Now, I just want to take another quick example here so we can look at this as close to like for like as actually possible. Now, let's take this 3-bedroom house in Walthamstow, which I found on Rightmove, which is far north of East London, so pretty far out. This house is a 3-bedroom house and it's on at £600,000. It's a pretty average house price, so looking at the area and the average rent, I think we'd be talking around £2,300 to £2,400 a month. Probably for this property, for the same property. If we put down a 10% deposit, so £60,000, we'd have a mortgage of £540,000, which would come in at around about, let's say, 4.5% interest rate, and that would give us a monthly cost of £3,000. So that would be £600 more expensive with maintenance costs to be added on top of that. But look, let's just be clear. Not every opportunity, area, or even flat is the same. There will be cases where rent is more, but in many cases it's not when you look at the entire picture. But of course, you do have to factor in that you are building equity. So not only do you need to find that 60 grand, you'd be paying more a month just to live in that property in this example. Now let's have a look at the opportunity cost here to see whether or not you'd be in a better position financially if you invested that money instead. So take that difference here of just the 600 quid. Do the versus the appreciation of the property value. If you invested in a simple index fund like the S&P 500, you could expect around 10% right now, but let's call it 7% for good measure. With a £600 a month contribution, in 25 years, you could have close to £489,000. And this is also without the savings that you might have also had that you would have been putting towards your deposit to get that 60 grand to even buy that £600,000 house in the first place. So there is a difference here for sure, and certainly some opportunity cost at play depending on how you look at it. But yes, Sammy, what about the house increasing? What about the equity that we're building? Let's have a little look at that next. Now, investing is obviously far from guaranteed returns, so you could always get back less than what you put in. But house prices don't always go up. In fact, between 2007 and 2009, house prices dropped by 19% in the UK, and in some years it barely rises at all. Although yes, most years it does rise, the average over the last 25 years, house prices have actually trebled, which is pretty good, but you still have to factor in the inflation that could happen here too. It varies massively by area, of course, and what you buy, the age of the property, how you upkeep it. There are so many factors at play here for sure, but there is no denying that there are plenty of scenarios where the cost of buying a house will 100% be worth it. The ownership thing here as well is something not to be sniffed at in my opinion, but you have just got to be aware of what you're getting yourself into, the full financial picture. Now, this calculator is actually a really good example of when you run the numbers, you can see whether or not a property is worth the investment versus renting and investing, the difference. Now, if I take the average house price at £293,000 and a £50,000 deposit with a 4.7% interest rate, which is about what you'd be paying now, give or take, and then a one-off cost at 5%, which is pretty normal, and then a 1 to 2% appreciation cost on that property with a 1% year maintenance cost. Now, over to the renting section here, the average rent is currently £1,350 a month, and stock market returns at a pretty normal 7 to 8%. Now, you can see here along the graph that it's pretty level pegging along the way of buying does eventually win out. But if I was to decrease the rent to say £1,250 a month, then renting ends up very much in our favour if we're investing alongside it. But at £1,500 a month, in rent, it sways completely in the opposite direction to the buyer's side. Even a minor sway in costs can have a massive impact on your finances in the longer run. So have a play around with this, as your situations will vary quite a bit. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes below, and then you can feel a little bit more comfortable with your own decisions that you make. Now, alongside this, there is obviously the psychological aspect of buying versus renting. If you buy a house, you know where you live and what your payments are going to be for the time that that mortgage is fixed for. You can bang up pictures, knock down walls, build extensions, and flatten it all to the ground if you really wanted to. Now, apart from knocking it down to the ground, doing work to your house could potentially increase the value of it, resulting in higher net worth being more added to your nest egg just by doing that. Whereas with renting, you could be served notice, prices could change in an instant, and you have to get permission to do pretty much anything and everything in that house. All I encourage people to do is know their numbers. When it comes to this decision, which is probably the biggest, most important financial decision that you can make, you need to be okay with your decision. You need to know what you're paying and what opportunities that hold you back from. There's plenty of reasons to get onto the property ladder. There's also situations where renting is better for you and your current lifestyle as well. Now guys, if you like this video, then I think the perfect one to follow on from this is why London's rental market is out of control, which is coming up on screen right now. But if you're not a Londoner, then my should I overpay my mortgage or invest video is also a good one to look at too, and that's coming up on screen right now as well. And I've left a link to the calculators used in this video below so you can have a play around with these yourself, and make sure you're subscribed. We drop videos every few days and would love to see you in the next one. This has been real fun, and peace out guys.